thanks for joining me today. We're picking up in Hebrews chapter 5. I think maybe today we'll just jump right into it. I'm reading out of the ESV. You're going to see it right there on your screen. You're going to hear it. But I want to encourage you to, if you have a Bible, to grab a pen and cut it up yourself, underline, circle, highlight, take notes, whatever. But if you don't, then this is kind of the value, one of the values of the tech, is that you can see it right there. But I'd love for you to be involved and engaged, and whether you write it in your own Bible or not, that we would be listening to the Holy Spirit for what He wants to say to each one of us, because that message is oftentimes different. And so we're going to pick up right here, chapter 5. This is what it says. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." And he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." Alright. So we're getting into a section on the priesthood in relationship to Jesus. And it's expressing from the very beginning what the role of the priest is: to act on behalf of men in relation to God. And so this was a really, really important aspect of the dynamic of relationship that God had with humanity for quite a long time, is that He established this order where there were certain men who would be intermediaries between God and the community. And unless you were raised in certain traditions in modern time, which there are some that emphasize more of this type of practice, unless you're raised in those traditions, you may not understand or resonate as much with this type of reality. But biblically speaking, this sort of separation was very normal, and that was the way God established it for some time. And whether or not He chose to do that specifically in history, simply to show when Jesus came as the high priest what He actually is and what He's doing, or if because God had established this, He's now describing Jesus as the high priest, either way, this is just what happened. And he would engage with His people via the avenue of His priestly leaders, and one of them in particular, the high priest, who was chosen to enter the most holy place. And so this foundation is important to understand, that the role of the priest is to act in between God and man. And so this is a good foundation, because what it's showing to us, and you probably maybe already know this and kind of feel this, but what it's going to begin to talk about is that Jesus has fulfilled that role for all time, that He Himself is our high priest, that we don't need another human being to go through, that we can go directly to God through personal relationship, which is why we live the way that we do now. And so it's a beautiful thing. The second thing that maybe you're wondering is, who is this Melchizedek? Well, he's actually kind of a mysterious guy in the Bible. He only shows up in a few places. So Abraham meets this mystery man Melchizedek and pays him a tithe, and it's like almost like Melchizedek you didn't know where he was from, and essentially I think most theologians would basically consider Melchizedek to be what's called a Christophany, which is an appearing of Christ in the Old Testament, or in the Old Testament time, sort of a manifestation of Christ in the divine as a precursor for his presence when he was here incarnated, as if to say that what Melchizedek set up, Jesus was fulfilling, a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And so, yeah, there's definitely more, and that's kind of an in-depth topic, and so, the primary purpose of this is not teaching, so I'm going to move on from that, and you can definitely study that more on your own. I want to just keep reading and see what the Lord wants to speak to us for today, for life. But this is definitely an interesting subject to study, Christophanies in general, Melchizedek and his identity, and kind of all that goes along with that. And so feel free to go ahead and study that. And if you do, hey, shoot me a message on what you come up with and what you learn. I'd love to hear from you. But for today, let's continue on in verse 7. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. It's just really interesting. His identity, he's the Son of God. Did he really need to learn obedience? Through what was suffered. That's just interesting to me. I mean, it seems like Jesus showed his obedience to the Father all throughout his life, even at age 12. I mean, he was sinless, so he never disobeyed. Yeah, I just don't know if I get that. Like, what type of obedience did he need to learn? And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Being designated by God as a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Interesting stuff. Generally, though, I suppose it's clear that Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. He's the one through whom he's the source of eternal salvation. And another warning. About this we have much to say, and it is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need somebody to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child, but solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. This dude's going in hard today. So it's like all these sections of Jesus is greater than this. Now here's a warning. Jesus is greater than this. Now here's a warning. Jesus is greater than this. And then the subtitle says warning against apostasy. And apostasy is the falling away from, which I don't necessarily see in here specifically. But let's see a few things. Okay, so they've become dull at hearing. For by this time they ought to have been teachers, but instead they need somebody to teach the basic principles of the oracles of God. You should be eating solid food, but instead you need milk. And by the way, everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he's a child. Solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice. Power of discernment trained by constant practice to do what? To distinguish good from evil. This is sticking out to me, constant practice. I actually can't recall many places where it's talking about a spiritual gift like this. And there might be some, I just can't recall them. And so as I'm sitting here just reading the Bible, and I'm thinking whatever I'm thinking, and based on whatever it is I know or don't know, this is what's speaking to me today. Aside from the fact that these people are getting completely rebuked for being dull at hearing and not listening, but more than that they should be more mature than they are, and they're still eating like little children, and they're getting called out on that. That here's an application of like something that a human can do to be part of this thing. Like it's not just like God gives you this gift or not, God is maturing you or not, but that there's a cooperation between what God does and what we do to step into hearing and listening and maturing and discernment, and that constant practice, having their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. It's just interesting because I can't recall many places where it's discussing a spiritual gift that is talking about us constantly practicing it. Maybe practice hospitality, but I like even preaching, prophesying, things like that. Like I don't recall passages that are talking about constantly practicing, but it's clearly important. Constantly practice distinguishing between good from evil. So, I guess that's my takeaway. Aside from this cool stuff about Jesus, but like, what's a practical takeaway? Is that I don't know. I'm just like wondering, am I to the place of maturity that God would want me? I have an expectation for my 10-year-old of maybe where she should be at in her growth and maturity. I have an expectation for my 6-year-old, and I guess the Lord has an expectation for me. And it's just getting me to think, like, am I really living into and stepping up to where He wants me to be at this point in my life? And So maybe you would ask yourself that same question and take that to prayer. But that seems like a pretty good takeaway, and this idea of practicing to distinguish between good and evil. So that's what I got for today. It appears that this book is kind of going one chapter at a time, so we'll just see how much longer that lasts, but that's what we got for today, and we'll see you again tomorrow, beginning of chapter 6.